Well, for more on the latest, then, Aaron David Miller joins us on the program now. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. So Saturday's exchange, of course, marks the final swap of living hostages under the first phase of this ceasefire agreement. What's your assessment on how likely phase two is to be implemented?
There's one addition. Thanks for having me. There's one additional exchange next week. Four remaining bodies are going to be returned to the Israelis. Look, I think you have three options. Number one, a negotiated implementation of phase two. I think that's almost impossible to imagine right now. Secondly, an extension of phase one, in which Israel and Hamas agree, both because it's in their interest, to exchange additional hostages for more Palestinian prisoners and the continuation of badly needed humanitarian and reconstruction assistance into Gaza, or third, the resumption of fighting. I think, frankly, you're going to end up with two or three.
What interest does either side having then in refusing to implement the next phase as it was initially intended, or even more so in resuming fighting?
Well, because I think the stage two enjoins both sides to do things that neither side is willing to do. Hamas is obligated to return all of the remaining hostages. Let's assume the Hamas holds 59, half of whom are no longer alive, males, Israeli soldiers, and to end any military activity against Israel. The Israelis are enjoined to withdraw from Gaza and to end the war. I don't think Hamas will agree to return all of the hostages. It's their final card, unless there are ironclad guarantees that Israel will stop the war and withdraw all of its forces. Nobody is going to give that guarantee to Hamas, not the Qataris, not the Egyptians, not the Americans. And the Israelis are not going to withdraw from Gaza unless there are assurances that, in fact, there is a security regime structured which will prevent Hamas's resurgence. In fact, I think they intend to have the overriding responsibility for security until such time as you end up with such a regime. And Mr. Netanyahu has added another dimension, which is the elimination of Hamas and the expulsion of its leadership. So the odds of this happening, phase two, on time or anytime soon, I think are pretty bleak.
Despite a very vocal movement in Israel lobbying for the release of all hostages, this really does not seem to be Netanyahu's priority. He said, as you suggested there, that he'll continue the war until Hamas is eradicated, though most observers say that that's completely unrealistic. So I have two questions. First, what is he hoping to achieve, in your view, in the long term, as in terms of something that's actually realistic? And secondly, we heard our Israel correspondent Noga Tarnopolsky say just moments ago that Israelis are actually more relying on Donald Trump to help get all of the hostages released rather than Netanyahu. So why would Trump be in a better position for that to happen?
That would demand that the U.S. president basically bring a significant amount of pressure, primarily on the Israelis, to essentially fulfill their terms under the agreement. But every signal that Donald Trump is sending, from his releasing of the shipment of 2,000-pound bombs to his acquiescence in Israeli activities in the West Bank, to comments that he made only yesterday, in which he basically said, I'm leaving it to the prime minister to decide whether he wants to prioritize the return of hostages or to continue his campaign against Hamas. So unless the president basically fundamentally changed his view and was prepared to engage in a serious confrontation with the Israelis, I think it's unlikely right now that Trump is willing to bring the kind of pressure on the Israeli government that would secure implementation of phase two. Remember, we're not dealing here with an agreement between between the U.S. and France. we're dealing here with an agreement between the state of Israel, however objectionable some of its policies, and an organization which the United States identifies by statute and law as a foreign terrorist organization, which has seized hostages and murdered them, and it is now orchestrating in their release a sort of grotesque and ghoulish sort of play in which they're manipulating, frankly, both living hostages and the dead. So I think this is going to be a very tough lift in the weeks ahead.
Sir, we just have time for one more question. I'd like to ask you then, in the long term, what impact, or even in the medium term, what impact do you think that the intervention that we've seen thus far from Donald Trump will have had both on the war and also, on Israel's position in the Middle East at large? Who will benefit from it and who will it hurt?
Look, governing is about choosing. And presidents, I worked for half a dozen administrations, Republicans and Democrats. Presidents have to decide what's important to them. Right now, the administration has engaged in the preliminary stages of an extraordinarily difficult enterprise, brokering and mediating a ceasefire agreement, and even more, between Russia and Ukraine. The president's nominal and actual effective special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is also participating, it seems, in the Russia-Ukraine negotiation. So again, the president needs to decide how important dealing with Gaza is, and then deciding whether or not he's interested in pursuing a broader Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Saudi, Arab-Israeli regional peace agreement. So again, not at all clear that that's his key priority.
Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's all we have time for. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.